What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Awesemo Fantasy Football YouTube channel. We are plugging away through our division previews. Today, we will be talking NFC East, and with me to do so is Nick Lepri. You can follow him on Twitter at Notorious Fantasy. Nick, we're coming off the long holiday weekend. I hope you enjoyed yourself. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing excellent. I had a great weekend. I hope everyone, including you, the chat, everyone had a great time this weekend. And I hope we continue to have a great summer going forward. I love the summer, and summer's the best because once it ends, then you got football. So very excited.
And yeah, for sure. And even now, our sponsor, who we'll talk about a little later, Underdog, is making things very exciting this summer. I've been doing a ton of these drafts, and I'm going to continue doing so. When we talk division previews, we're going to start with coaching changes, roster changes, and then we'll get into a little bit of the expectations for next year, including win total. And we will round things out with some fantasy discussion, talk about some Underdog ADP and what players we think can be of value this year. But before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. I was a little surprised by the win totals in this division. We typically are going projected worst to first, and in this division, the NFC East, it's the New York Giants, and they have a 7.0 win total. I mean, for a team that was as bad as they were last year, they still have Daniel Jones under center. I was a little bit surprised by this, but you look at some of the positives. They make the head coaching change. It's Brian Daboll coming over from the Bills. He was their OC, and he did a lot of great things developing Josh Allen. They bring in Mike Kafka as their offensive coordinator. He's the former Chiefs quarterbacks coach and pass game coordinator, so a lot of experience developing Patrick Mahomes. And they bring over Wink Martindale from the Ravens. He was their DC for the past 4 seasons. They also have a couple roster changes, but I'll let you get into those. What do you make of the New York Giants just from an overarching perspective ahead of 2022?
Yeah, like you said, I'm definitely surprised that their win total is at 7. If it was set at 5.5, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, 7 seems a little crazy in my opinion. Now, could it be possible? Yes, because I think going from Joe Judge to Brian Daboll is a humongous step up here. Now having Brian Daboll as the head coach, I honestly think Joe Judge was just out of it last year. Like there were these plays, especially towards the end of the season. If you remember against Washington, it's like 3rd and 30 and they're running it on the 1 yard line, doing a QB sneak. It's like, what are you even thinking? Like, does this guy even want to have a job next year? Like, it didn't seem like it. He wasn't even coaching for his job. He was just like, let's just get out of here and then I'll go back to New England or I'll go do something else, right? That's what it really seemed like. So I think Brian Daboll here will be a huge step up. Now, will Brian Daboll be able to transform Daniel Jones like he did with Josh Allen? This is probably a 1-year thing for Daniel Jones, right? If Daniel Jones does not step up this season, then he's probably gone. They don't pick up his 5th-year option. I don't really think that in 1 year, Brian Daboll is going to be able to take a guy who has fumbling problems, interception problems, he has a lot of problems at playing the quarterback position. And I don't think you're going to be able to figure that out in just 1 year if you're the head coach of the Giants. So I think if Daboll got there 2 years ago, then maybe Daniel Jones has a chance in the NFL, but probably the ship has sailed for Daniel Jones being a starting quarterback. But I do think Brian Daboll could elevate this team past 5 wins, 6 wins. 7 wins is just crazy to me. I think that this team is definitely better than it was last year. And I think it has to they're going to win more games because they don't have Joe Judge as their head coach. But I don't think that this team is going to make some crazy leap and potentially make the playoffs this season. I am from New Jersey. I know a lot of Giants fans, and they're much happier going into this season compared to last season. But I think they're still at least a couple of years out from having a team that is legitimately competitive in the NFC. Even with how soft the NFC is, I still don't think the Giants really stand much of a chance in this division and in making the playoffs as a whole. So for the Giants overarching as a whole, I think this is a bad team. They'll be bad this year, but I think going forward, they have a lot of opportunity to grow and become one of the better teams in the NFC East.
Yeah, to me, they're a team that is embracing full rebuild. You look at just the players that have exited the roster, there's a lot more than players they've brought in, and they've let a lot of premier players go at that. You know, like Jabril Peppers, and you look in the offensive line, no more Nate Solder, no more Will Hernandez, no more Evan Ingram, Kyle Rudolph. They let a lot of players go. They bring in a few, so Matt Breida, Richie James, Tyrod Taylor, these are all just kind of like rotational backups at best, like just safety players. They bring in John Feliciano and Marco Lewinsky. I think those are the 2 most notable because you're trying to protect Daniel Jones. Really where they improved, I think, is the draft. And that's another sign of a team rebuilding They bring in Evan Neal and Kayvon Thibodeau, two premier players. Wan'Dale Robinson is a day 2 pick for them that can potentially help Daniel Jones. But ultimately, this is a team with a lot of resources in the offensive skill players. You have a former number 2 overall pick in Saquon Barkley. You pay Kenny Galladay the big bucks, and a lot of people talk about him not scoring a touchdown last year. That guy was banged up all throughout the season. He actually sustained his first injury in the preseason, and then it was just injury after injury. And we've talked about this with players like Ezekiel Elliott and some others. We don't dock players that miss games, but when guys battle through injuries and maybe don't perform up to expectation, they seem to get docked more than others. And Kenny Galladay appears to be experiencing that. And then they have Kadarius Toney, former first rounder, rounding things out for Daniel Jones. So I like what they're doing with Jones. They're going to know after this year whether he's the answer. Right now, early signs point to them moving on based on, they didn't pick up the 5th-year option. But if he has this big step forward, this is how you evaluate that with the players they have around him. So I think it's going to at least be exciting in New York. Like maybe they won't win a ton of games, but they're going to be throwing the ball over the yard. Dable was the orchestrator of that 4-wide system in Buffalo. So I am excited. The one thing I'll say about the schedule is it is pretty dang easy. This NFC East, I think, has the easiest schedule as a division. They're going to be playing the NFC North, so you're getting Detroit and Chicago. They get the AFC South, so you get Houston and Jacksonville. And then for the Giants specifically, they're playing a 4th-place schedule. So NFC West, they're going to get Seattle. NFC South, you're going to get, the Panthers. Those are winnable games. I could see them getting to like 6 wins, but even in 7, it's still pretty rich for me. Anything else to add on the player personnel moves and maybe just the offense as a whole?
Yeah, I like what you brought up about the offense because overall, this is a pretty solid, maybe not the offensive line, but the offensive players. Like, if healthy, Saquon Barkley, you could make the argument that he's a top 5, top 3 back in the NFL. I wouldn't say he's the best, but you could probably make the argument that maybe he is. And then Kenny Galladay, if you look back to not last season, but prior to that in Detroit, Kenny Galladay looked like he was potentially a top 12 receiver in the NFL. Now, could that be because Matt Stafford was so good? Or is that because Kenny Galladay is so good? You never really know. But I really think Kenny Galladay is much better than he played last season. And then they have Kadarius Toney as well. I know you made the joke about talking about how there are 0 touchdowns from Kenny Galladay. I talk about that all the time. How Kadarius Toney and Kenny Galladay both scored a total of 0 touchdowns last year. That's not good, but that's bound to increase this season. And if we're talking about fantasy football, I honestly think Kadarius Toney might be one of the better value picks in drafts. Now, you don't get any points for when he fights the Cowboys like last season, if you remember that, when he just started beating the shit out of that guy. But I think that Kadarius Toney this year has a very big opportunity to build on what he did last year and play even better.
I agree with you 100%. Speaking to the fantasy side of things, and we're going to use underdog ADP for this discussion, all the Giants pass catchers are going outside the top 100. You have Kadarius Toney at 107, extremely affordable. You have Kenny Galladay at 121, basically 122. Again, extremely affordable. And then really late in drafts, you have Wan'Dale Robinson going at pick 188. And I fully expect him to be the wide receiver 3. Sterling Shepard coming off a torn Achilles. There's a strong chance he's not ready for the beginning of the season. And we've seen Achilles last up to a full year in terms of recovery, and he tore it late in the year. So we're just going to have to monitor Sterling. In his place, I'm so comfortable taking Wan'Dale right now. The guy was the second round pick. So that's a lot of draft capital. And even though he's small and a lot of the drafting community didn't like him for his size, we have to take into consideration how high the Giants thought of him in the draft capital. So outside the top 100, I'm just going to be taking shots on all of these guys in an ascending offense. It kind of reminds me of like the Dolphins a little bit last year, where you had a lot of players coming off the board a little bit later, like a Jalen Waddle and Mike Gesicki, and you could take shots on all of them. And some of them ended up having good years. Some of them didn't. I kind of expect that to be the case with the Giants here. And even Saquon Barkley's value, maybe you can talk about him too. But what do you make of these players for fantasy?
Yeah, my favorite player probably besides Kadarius Toney here would be Daniel Jones. Now, I don't have him ranked really high, but I think that the ceiling for him is huge because of the kind of player he is. But because the kind of player he is, that also means the floor is pretty low, right? When Daniel Jones has a bad game, you're going to be really mad that you decided to play him, that you decided to go crazy and play Daniel Jones. But when he goes off, when he has that big game, he really does have that 30-plus point upside. And that is something that I'm very interested in fantasy. Now, if I'm drafting one quarterback, there's no way I'm drafting Daniel Jones. But if I'm going to be willing to hold a guy on my bench and just draft a guy for the upside, maybe I want to play him up against those bad games, right? When he plays up against those really bad teams, then I'll roll Daniel Jones out. Then I'm fine doing that because I think that Daniel Jones, with the rushing upside that he has, with Brian Daboll as the head coach now, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Daniel Jones really stepped up for fantasy. If he starts lessening the amount of interceptions he throws and he starts running the ball just as much as he used to, then I really think that Daniel Jones could finish as a top 10 quarterback. I'm not going to rank him there. I'm not going to tell you to draft him as a top 10 quarterback, but I will tell you that if you draft him as your backup or if you're in a super flex league, he's a very interesting quarterback too, with a ton of upside in a lot of these matchups, like you said, because the schedule is pretty soft for the Giants. Even if they're not winning these games, they should be very competitive in these games. And since they're going to be down in some of these games as well, they're going to have to pass the ball a lot into the games. Now, that could cause Daniel Jones to throw like 4 fucking interceptions, but it could also cause Daniel Jones to go crazy late on in the game. So I like Daniel Jones a ton at his ADP. And if we're talking about best ball, I have drafted a ton of Daniel Jones, Kadarius Toney, Sterling Shepard, these stacks, because you can already draft your primary stack and then later on in the draft, just take a secondary stack and have them on the cheap. Saquon Barkley is a player that I think I am completely out on compared to most people. I don't know about your opinion on him. Seems like Savoca loves Saquon Barkley. I don't like Saquon Barkley. I think that maybe he just hasn't been healthy. Maybe you can blame it on the Giants, Joe Judge. But I just haven't seen that flash out of him that I saw early on in his career. Could he turn it around? Definitely. Definitely could. But where he's going, the pick's a little too rich for me, in my opinion. I see him go in the second round a lot. His ADP right now is 26.6. I just don't feel comfortable drafting him there. And I know in my redraft league, since I live in New Jersey, a lot of my friends are Giants fans. They're going to draft Saquon Barkley much higher. There's no way I'm taking him.
I want to be on pace with the field with Saquon. I don't want to take a huge stand on him, and it's not because he's lost explosion. I honestly don't care about that. Najee Harris isn't explosive whatsoever and doesn't create any explosive plays, but he's a player that has incredible value because of the volume. I think the volume is what's key for Saquon, and the concern is that he was splitting time with Devontae Booker. Now, maybe that's injury related. Maybe that's because he hasn't been efficient. So we'll have a new coaching staff coming in, and we should get a pretty good idea of what Saquon is early in the year. But there is that risk that he is just a committee back at this point, which is pretty sad to say for a guy who was drafted number 2 overall. But injuries have really been the downfall of him. Last thing I'll say about this team before we can move on is the defense is actually a little better than I thought going into this. So looking at the defense, they're not complete. And again, this is the sign of a rebuilding team, but they have a lot of good pieces in place and high draft picks. They have, Leonard Williams, Dexter Lawrence, and they add Kayvon Thibodeau to a defensive line, which is surprisingly pretty strong. They took Azeez Ojulari, an edge rusher, as well, so he could fit into that maybe as a rotational rusher. Where I think they're weak is the back end, and I think their best players are going to be Adoree Jackson and Xavier McKinney. I think the jury's still kind of out on both those players. Adoree certainly hasn't lived up to the draft hype that he had, and McKinney's battled a lot of injuries in his career, so we'll have to see with them. But overall, I view that as the weakness of their defense. And if you have a weak secondary, that could lead to a lot of shootouts, just highlighting your point you made earlier. Anything else to add with this team?
Yeah, I don't really see too much. The only other thing I would add is that Daniel Jones does kind of like throwing to the tight end. So if you are taking like a late round throw in a best ball draft, I want to draft him in a fantasy football draft, a redraft league. But I think Ricky Seals-Jones, with what he showed last year, could be a sneaky pick if you want to draft like a third tight end, if you don't feel super comfortable with your tight end core.
Yeah, their tight end depth chart is horrible. Behind Ricky Seals-Jones, it's Jake Hausman, Chris Myrick, and Daniel Bellinger. Like, my goodness. Seals-Jones should be on the field as much as he can possibly be. All right, let's move on to Washington. The Commanders, they're projected slightly ahead of the New York Giants in terms of win total. They're at 8.0. I don't really view them as being a significantly better team. They're benefiting from the same easy schedule. They're going to play a third place schedule, which actually is a little bit more difficult. You're going to get some tougher teams, like the AFC North third place finisher was the Browns. So, I mean, like, that's a tough opponent. It's just slightly harder than the Giants overall. When you look at this team, it's largely the same as last year. I mean, they bring back the same coaching staff. It's Ron Rivera. He's good old boys with Scott Turner, so he's going to be there at OC. Jack Del Rio has been their defensive coordinator since 2020. It's just the same unit we've seen from this team. The only major difference is they bring in Carson Wentz. So I think you can argue a slight upgrade from what they had at quarterback last year. I mean, we were seeing like Kyle Allen and all kinds of just disaster quarterback play from this team. And Wentz, I don't think he's a solid quarterback. Like, I think he's probably around QB 25 in the NFL, but he's still an upgrade. Other than that, this is a team that didn't have a lot of draft picks. I mean, they draft Jahan Dawson in the first round, but they don't really add a lot of players in the draft. They don't add a lot of players in free agency either. They bring back McKissick and Cam Sims, bring in Cornelius Lucas. I think their biggest signing is probably Andrew Norwell, but I mean, very, very scarce in terms of signings and additions. It's basically the same team as last year. What do you think about this Washington Commanders team?
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever played Modern Warfare 2, but the first mission in that video game is called Same Shit, Different Day. And that's exactly what the Washington Commanders are. It's the same thing as last year. You got Carson Wentz, who is just he's Carson Wentz, right? He really hasn't done much recently to tell me that he is going to be the guy that leads this team to winning over 8 games. This is another team where I'm just taking the under. I don't care about the Giants or the Commanders, but I think the Commanders are legitimately worse than the Giants. And I think at least with the Giants, you can see some upside, right? You can see these guys really turning it up and the Giants potentially winning a decent amount of games. But with the Washington Commanders, I just don't really see it. I think that the team is okay. Their best player is Terry McLaurin, and Terry McLaurin has never, or at least offensively, has never really made it click to where he becomes this guy that I really thought that he was going to be. For years, I've talked up Terry McLaurin, and for years, I've been a little bit disappointed. Again, I think he's a talented receiver. It's just that Washington has kind of failed him in a way, and I don't know if Carson Wentz is going to be able to elevate Terry McLaurin to do that. The Washington football team does have a pretty solid, the Washington Commanders now, does have a pretty solid defense, obviously. When you have Chase Young, Montez Sweat, there's some reason to believe that they could be a pretty solid defense. Yet again, the defense definitely did let down, in my opinion, last year, because when they playing up against the Bucs in the playoffs last year with Taylor Heineke, the defense is looking good. It's like, wow, how good could this defense be in 2021? And then we watch the games. I don't know. Maybe it's Jack Del Rio's fault. I'm not going to blame him necessarily, but things aren't looking great. And I think in 2022, they're just an all right defense. They're an all right team as a whole. They are probably the least interesting team that we have talked about thus far in any of these videos, because I really just like, even with the Panthers, it's like, oh, maybe we get to see someone other than Sam Darnold, or, oh, what could Christian McCaffrey do? Or the Falcons, maybe Mariota is going to be back and he's going to be great, right? The Washington Commanders, this is just terrible. Like, there's just nothing fun to talk about. I think, though, that a lot of people are going to fall back into the Antonio Gibson trap in fantasy. And when we talk about that, I don't want Antonio Gibson. I don't want anything to do with him.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. I agree with you from a roster building perspective. Not a ton of additions. They do bring in Sam Howell in the draft, but again, he has 5th-round draft capital. So regardless of if you ranked him in the top 5 quarterbacks right alongside guys like Malik Willis, he just wasn't drafted there. So I'm not even expecting him to see the field this year. I don't even know if he'll be active on game days. It would kind of surprise me. But like you said, I view the defense being the strength of this team. I think the best player on the football team or the Commanders is Chase Young when he's healthy,
Agreed.
which he was not last year. So you combine Montez Sweat, Daron Payne, Jonathan Allen, Chase Young. That's a really solid defensive line. They drafted Jamin Davis at linebacker really high. So, I mean, they have a lot of capital on him. And then their defensive backfield is actually decent too, with William Jackson, Kendall Fuller, Cameron Curl, and whoever they decide to play the slot. They invested some in Benjamin St. Juste and Corn Elder. So it's a pretty decent defense. I say above average. And I think that's where the gap is between the Giants and the Washington football team here. The Commanders keep going back and forth here. They just have a better defense overall. For the win total, for me, it's a clear under. I'm probably staying away from the Giants, but not optimistic about the Commanders here whatsoever. For fantasy purposes, they're a really tough team to evaluate. I actually like what Scott Turner has kind of done as the OC of the Commanders. He just hasn't had any talent at the quarterback position, and I'm not sure Carson Wentz is the upgrade he needs. That's more of a problem with the GM than it is Scott Turner himself. When you look at ADPs of these guys, we can start with Gibson. He's coming off the board at 63.5. That's a little rich for me as well. When you look at what the team has done, bringing back J.D. McKissick, who has vultured Antonio Gibson on 3rd downs for his entire career. They spent a good amount of draft capital on Brian Robinson, a former 3-down back from Alabama with good size and speed. Like, that's just kind of an indictment on a player in Antonio Gibson whose contract is going to be expiring shortly. Outside of that, I think McLaurin's still fine. 45.5 ADP. He's in that wide receiver dead zone. So you're basically saying, would you rather have McLaurin or DK Metcalf or, Mike Williams, some of these players that all have warts. So he's not coming off the board at a place where he's unattainable and a huge risk. Everyone in that range is a risk. The one player I want to ask you about is Jahan Dawson, though. He's coming off the board at 145. I think he's a player that could have some value. We've seen the wide receiver too situationally have value for the Commanders. It's just, it hasn't been a consistent player. Curtis Samuel wasn't able to stay healthy enough. So could it actually be Dotson? The 1st-round draft capital is pretty enticing.
Yeah, now I think going into the draft, if you said that some team drafted Jahan Dotson in the 2nd round, you wouldn't be surprised. But drafting him this early tells me that the Washington football team, the Commanders, Goddamn, I
I
keep
did that
forgetting their
too, like
name.
6 times, man.
Yeah, okay. So the Commanders, they drafted him highly. They have to have seen something to believe in him, right? So the fact that they drafted him so highly tells me that he's going to be seeing a lot of work early on and that he is the clear number 2 wide receiver on this team behind Terry McLaurin. I agree with you that Jahan Dawson is very interesting, and where he's going at pick 144 in a redraft league, that's basically free, right? That's like one of the last picks you're making in an underdog draft. It goes a little bit deeper than that, right? In a best ball draft, but in a redraft draft, that's just the final shot you take. And if Carson Wentz does play slightly better than he did last year, and while I like to dog on Carson Wentz, he actually wasn't that bad last year, right? He really wasn't. It's just that if the Colts had basically any other quarterback, like they probably would have been a lot better, right? Like if they had Matt Ryan last year, the Colts probably win a playoff game, make it to the playoffs, right? So I think that Jahan Dotson's in an all right situation to succeed. This is probably going to be a team that is going to be down as well, even if the defense is the bright spot on their team. So I think Jahan Dotson is interesting. I don't think I'm going to have a heavy ownership of him in terms of my redraft drafts and in my best ball drafts, but I do think that the spot is very interesting for a huge boom potentially with the Washington Football Commanders.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of anyone on this team. The players I'm most overweight on are Terry McLaurin and Dotson. Wentz at 200.1 ADP. I think you just take him if you end up like with McLaurin early in your last round. You're looking for a stacking partner. That's where I'm okay with Wentz. Gibson, I'm going to be underweight on the field on. You and I both outlined that. The only other player really of consequence is Logan Thomas, and he's really hard to draft right now because of the week 13 ACL tear. You just might be eating like maybe even like 8 games of zeros, depending on how this recovery goes. And ACLs are getting better, but they're still volatile. You see players like Odell Beckham miss over a year, and then you see other players come back in closer to 6 months. So that's just a name you'll have to watch with Logan Thomas. I don't like taking zero, so if I end up seeing positive reports, I'll start taking him more in the future. Anything else to add with the Commanders? For me, it's a firm under on their win total at 8.
Yeah, I agree on the under. I have a decent amount of Logan Thomas on my underdog drafts, but that's not necessarily because I think that he's going to finish inside the top 10 or something. But I think that if he does get healthy, say by week 4, that as my number 2 tight end, assuming my number 1 guy stays healthy, I think that Logan Thomas, we saw last year, he is pretty solid. And he could be a guy that if you're looking for a late round guy, say you already missed out on even those like tight ends 12 through 15, like the guys that I really like Hunter Henry, Pat Fryermouth, Mike Gesicki, those kind of guys, then I'm fine taking Logan Thomas and just hoping that he is healthy again. Like you said, it's all based on injury. And then just back real quick on Antonio Gibson. I just want to really push this point forward. I don't want to draft Antonio Gibson. What Riverboat Ron has been talking about with, oh, we want to do a committee, blah, blah, blah. Even if he didn't tell me that, I still would have believed this is going to be a committee. Antonio Gibson has been one of the most confusing guys to draft because the talent is there, but there's too many cooks in the kitchen here. And I think Brian Robinson is going to have a legitimate impact on this team. And that is why I've been drafting a lot of Brian Robinson in best ball drafts. Don't draft him in redrafts unless you're trying to handcuff. But I think that in a best ball format, we're to see a lot of Brian Robinson, I think, on the 1 yard line, just barreling his way through and scoring a touchdown.
And you absolutely could be right there. I think I should probably start taking him a little bit just because he's so cheap, going to like right around pick 180 in underdog drafts. And speaking of which, we've been hinting at the underdog ADP all day. Let's talk about them. Our sponsor of today's show, they're the best place to play fantasy in the summer months. They also just unleashed Best Ball Mania 3, which has a $10 million prize pool. Yes, $10 million. And it's super easy to draft one of these teams. You're literally just going to draft, and that's it. There's no waivers, there's no trades, there's no in-season management. Underdog's going to give you your best score every single week, and the highest score at the end of the year wins. Last year's Best Ball Mania Championship team was drafted in June. We're recording this May 31st, so we're in that hot spot time of year right now. There's literally no reason to wait. Underdog will double your first deposit up to $100 with the promo code Awesemo, which is good for 4 entries into this tournament we're talking about. Head over to underdog.com or to the App Store, or just click the link in the description of this video and sign up with the promo code Awesemo today. Love Underdog. We'll continue to talk about them with our next team, the Philadelphia Eagles. And man, I am excited about this team this year. Win total 9.5. I actually like the over on this, just kind of jumping the shark here. Philadelphia at 9.5 with some of the offseason moves they've made seems very, very generous. I mean, this division, again, we already talked about the schedule. You're getting NFC North, AFC South, a lot of easy teams in those. The division itself, like the Eagles have significant advantages over the Commanders and the Giants. It's a team I really like here, and they're playing a second place schedule, so you're still dodging the first. But when you look at their changes, coaching staff is all intact. They brought in Nick Sirianni, offensive, defensive coordinator. That's all the same. They're running it back with Jalen Hurts, who was decent last year as a passer. That's not really what he offers the offense, though. You're going to like Jalen Hurts for what he does on the ground with his legs. And a lot of people will knock him. But even with Hurts last year, this team was top 12 in offensive EPA. So maybe Hurts isn't the best passer, but what he's adding on the ground is still valuable enough to make this a top 12 offense without A.J. Brown. And now you're bringing A.J. Brown into the equation, which is just an incredible upgrade for this receiving core. I love Devontae Smith. I liked what he showed as a rookie. He hit all the thresholds you'd like to see. They have Quez Watkins and Greg Ward and Jalen Reagor, whoever they want as a situational player, and Goddard. So we have solid weapons around Jalen Hurts. I think this offense can only take steps forward. But talk to me about some of the changes and what you think about the Eagles overall.
Yeah, so you said you like the over 9.5. I love the over 9.5. If we were to pick a team to
Yes.
win this division, I think the Eagles are going to beat the Cowboys. They're going to win this division, and I love the Eagles. I've been on board with the Eagles even before they got A.J. Brown, and now that they have A.J. Brown, I'm all over the Eagles. Fly, Eagles, fly. I really think the Eagles, maybe they won't make too much noise in the playoffs, but I think they're going to get to the playoffs. I think they could potentially win 10 or 11 games with the schedule that they have been given. I think Nick Sirianni, I don't know too much about him, right? I think that he does these things, like especially with the shirts. He wears all these weird shirts to game day. I don't know if that really actually motivates the team. He wears like a beat the Cowboys shirt and then they lose by like 42. So it's like, what are you doing? But in reality, I think that this is a much better team compared to last year, especially offensively, right? When now Jalen Hurts doesn't have to rely on Jalen Reagor, who's just going to drop the ball, or these other wide receivers, right? Now he has A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith on his second year. I'm not super excited about Devontae Smith like you are, but I do think that he is a great player. And having him as the number 2 receiver on your team, there's not a lot of teams that have a number 2 receiver like Devontae Smith, right? And I think that in his second year, this will be a solid leap for him. My favorite player on this team is Dallas Goddard. I think that Dallas Goddard is one of the most underrated tight ends in the National Football League. He's been underrated for a while because he was kind of just stuck behind bars with Zach Ertz there, but now he has kind of escaped with Zach Ertz getting traded to the Arizona Cardinals last year. And I really think that in terms of fantasy football, Dallas Goddard is one of the better premier tight ends, I think, and he could easily finish in the top 5. As a whole, though, I think that this is a very good roster. I think that defensively, while I'm not in love with the defensive unit, I think they have a pretty solid defense as well. And with the offense that they have, with the upside that Jalen Hurts has, again, this is a team that can win a lot of games. And if Jalen Hurts even gets hurt, I think they could still get the over win total because I think Gardner Minshew is still pretty solid as well.
I agree with you. And I don't love Devontae Smith. I think he checks like every box you'd want for a rookie. So there's a chance for him to take a step forward. The main concern with him is going to be the pass level of the offense. And we'll talk about that when we get to the fantasy portion. But the roster's awesome. You mentioned all the skill players. Awesome. Offensive line, great. You have Jordan Mailata, Landon Dickerson, Jason Kelsey, Isaac Suamalo, Lane Johnson as your starters. And they finally have some depth, which they haven't had in years. You have Andre Dillard, former first rounder, as a backup swing tackle. You have Cam Jurgens coming over from Nebraska, who is a phenomenal prospect that they got a little later. On defense, man, their front 7 is loaded. Brandon Graham, Fletcher Cox, Javon Hargrave, Derek Barnett. And then to bolster some of that, they still have Milton Williams, Josh Sweat. They add Jordan Davis with the first-round pick. If you look at their linebacking core, Kaiser White, TJ Edwards, kind of that hybrid edge rusher, and they steal Nakobe Dean on day 2. They also have Hassan Reddick, who they brought in, former like hybrid edge rusher that the Arizona Cardinals drafted out of Temple. That's a ton of production in their front 7. And then they add James Bradbury to a unit that already had Darius Slay, Avonte Maddox. They took draft picks with Kari Vincent, Zach McPherson. And as safeties, you still have Kayvon Wallace, Anthony Harris. This defense, I think, is awesome. And I think they're going to have no problem shutting down teams like the Commanders and probably even the Giants on a week-to-week basis, not to mention their easy schedule. For fantasy purposes, and when we talk about underdog, my concern with the skill position players is the run-heavy nature of this team, which I don't think is going to change. I honestly think A.J. Brown coming over from the Tennessee Titans is going to be in a very similar offense to what we saw. He's going to have to live off efficiency. And based on the efficiency numbers, he's been a top 5 receiver in the NFL. It just comes down to he doesn't have the same volume as Devontae Adams, Stephon Diggs, and whoever else Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase at the top. But overall, talent-wise, efficiency numbers, he's right there. But the question is, at these ADPs, what do you make of this team, and who are you willing to draft?
Yeah, so one player that I've really had a hard time thinking about is Miles Sanders, because for years I've been someone who faded Miles Sanders because I thought the first, the second, the third round where you've had to draft him the last couple of years, I thought that was a little bit crazy. And while this team is pretty run heavy, I just never really saw Miles Sanders being the clear number one workhorse back on this team because he's just, in my opinion, not built like that. And I think that in 2022, now we've fallen so far, right? Now you're waiting until pick right now 78.9. So while I'm not in love with drafting him at pick 78.9, he's not my number one, my number two running back. He might not even be my number three running back. And with that ADP, I am willing to draft him. Now, I'm not going to tell you guys that he's going to be a top 12 running back because that's crazy. I wouldn't have told you that for the last couple of years when he was getting drafted there. But I do think that the upside is immense. Boston Scott, these other running backs that they have behind him right now, it is Miles Sanders, Kenneth Gainwell, Boston Scott, and Jason Huntley. Again, while none of those guys are really amazing, they're still going to be seeing work. And I think Kenneth Gainwell is kind of a sneaky player who's going to be seeing a decent amount of work as well. So Miles Sanders, I'm going to draft him on Underdog, but I think it's going to be very hard in your redraft league to determine which week to start him. But then again, you're getting him at pick 78, so I'm fine drafting him. My favorite player on this team, like I said, is Dallas Goddard. I think that Dallas Goddard is going to continue to put up points. Jalen Hurts has proved year in and year out, like last year, like I thought he was going to, that he loves to throw the ball to the tight end. He loves to throw the ball to Dallas Goddard. And if Goddard is able to stay healthy, then I think Dallas Goddard could really finish as top 5 guy. And then Jalen Hurts, of course, I love, but that's like a basic take, right? Everyone knows why you like Jalen Hurts because the guy can fucking run for 1,000,000 yards. He might finish number 1 in rushing attempts, rushing yards, rushing touchdowns. Wouldn't surprise me at all. So that's more of a basic take. And then when it comes to more of the deep takes from these guys, like the late round picks, I'm be honest with you, there's no way I'm taking Quez Watkins, Jalen Reagor, any of these other wide receivers on the team with such a run-heavy approach. I think either draft A.J. Brown, Dallas Goddard. Maybe you're willing to take the shot on Devontae Smith, but besides that, this is kind of an offense where even on Underdog, if I draft Jalen Hurts, I don't know how overexcited I am to draft a guy like Quez Watkins or Jalen Reagor to stack with Jalen Hurts.
Well, the problem is it's a run-heavy offense, and you need 2 injuries for them to really walk into any sort of volume. Like,
yeah,
the pecking order is going to be A.J. Brown 1 and then some combination of Devontae Smith, Dallas Goddard 3. So without injuries, Quez Watkins and Reagor are going to be the 4 and 5, and then you're betting on the 4th and 5th receiver in the Eagles offense. I'm fully out on them as well. I'd rather take flyers on more unsettled situations. But I love Hurts at his ADP and across the industry. It's shocking he hasn't climbed more. 65 is just too low for a guy with his rushing upside. We're in lockstep with Sanders, so I won't belabor that point. Just pick 79 way too late for a player that has a path to potential 3-down workload. I'm out on Gainwell. I would rather have Boston Scott. That's just because Boston Scott's already played over Gainwell. And Gainwell, is a day 3 pick. Boston Scott was undrafted, but at the same time, these guys already played in the same offense, and Scott already played ahead of Gainwell. At receiver, I don't think I'm going to be high on Devontae Smith. I'd rather take a shot on Goddard a little bit cheaper. Don't think their volume will be too different. A.J. Brown's a player I want to stay towards the field on or slightly underway just because of the pass volume in this offense. But overall, A.J. Brown's going off the board at pick 25, so he's in that 2nd, 3rd round turn. You just don't want to miss on A.J. Brown if he has that blow-up season, in my opinion. So when he falls a couple picks, that's when I'm going to try to snag him. But he's also not a guy I want to be super overweight on. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think a lot of the reason why A.J. Brown is going at pick 24.9, going in that 2nd round, 3rd round turn range is because people understand, just like we do, that, getting him 1,000,000 targets is probably not going to happen, right? He's not going to finish inside the top 5, top 10 in targets, but it's all about the efficiency. And even if Jalen Hurts isn't as quote unquote good of a passer as Ryan Tannehill, when Ryan Tannehill was struggling last year, A.J. Brown still flourished. So I really think that A.J. Brown is in not necessarily the best situation for him to finish as a top 5 guy, but he's so talented that as long as Jalen Hurts is somewhat of a confident quarterback, competent throwing the football, I expect A.J. Brown to finish inside the top 12. And I understand why people are a little lower on him, though, but I still am very confident drafting him there. And I wouldn't be surprised if his ADP moved up, not into the 1st round, but into the middle of the 2nd round. once people really start to understand how good AJ Brown is.
Yeah, I think that's fair as well. Let's round this out with our last team. It's the Dallas Cowboys, projected for a half win, more than the Eagles are sitting at 10.0. Another team without any coaching changes. They're running it back with good old Mike McCarthy. Kellen Moore, he's been there for the last 3 years now. Dan Quinn was hired in 2021, previous Falcons head coach. He now coordinates the defense. This offense has more departures than additions. And a lot of that's because of the salary cap mayhem they got in when they signed Ezekiel Elliott to that egregious deal. So their offense looks largely the same outside of a few players exiting. Some of the players that they lost, the biggest one's going to be Amari Cooper, but you also lost Cedric Wilson, Blake Jarwin, Lyle Collins, Connor Williams, Randy Gregory, DeMonte Casey, Keanu Neal. It's a lot of players gone from this team, and they haven't added a ton. You look at the players that they've added, it's James Washington, Jeremy Sprinkle, Dante Fowler, like Malik Hooker, players they're just taking some flyers on because of the salary cap, how they've been in. So in my opinion, this is a roster that's a little bit worse, not to mention they spent their first round pick on a developmental tackle who led the NCAA in penalties, and Tyler Smith. I think he's going to probably play inside here. I don't know. I think this team got worse than last year. They still have the kind of like raw structure of being a high-powered offense. They're extremely pass-heavy. They're extremely up-tempo because of Kellen Moore. But I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say this offense took a step forward. I'll just say that. And I think at worst, they took a big step back.
Yeah, I agree. I think they did take a step back, but I still think their win total at 10 is pretty fair. If I'm being honest with you, I think
easy schedule.
They could definitely win 12, 13 games. Like I said, I do think the Eagles are going to win the division, but it really is just a race between the Eagles and the Cowboys. And with how kind of soft this schedule is, 10 wins does almost seem kind of low still, even though the team isn't that team they were last year because of just how good the offense is. And Dak had a lot of inconsistency last year. There was games where, if you remember the start of the season, Dak up against the Bucks, it was like, holy shit, man, maybe Dak is going to be a top 5 quarterback this year. And then he kind of tapers off, gets a little hot, tapers off again, gets a little hot again. So I think that this year, if he's able to play a little bit more consistently, even if they lost Amari Cooper, they lose Cedric Wilson, I still think that the Dallas Cowboys offense as a whole is one of the best units in the NFL. And if Dak is able to stay consistent, this is a team that is going to be very scary. They'll probably choke in the playoffs again, just like they always do. But I mean, they're still one of the best offenses in the NFL, at least in terms of the skill group. Maybe not the offensive line, but the skill group of Ezekiel Elliott, CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup is pretty underrated in my opinion. They bring in James Washington, who I like as well. They drafted Jalen Tolbert, but I wouldn't be surprised if James Washington was the number 3 guy on this team for a lot of the season. So I like James Washington a ton in underdog drafts. As a whole, though, I wish the Cowboys, if you're a Cowboys fan, I don't even think you want Mike McCarthy anymore. I don't think Mike McCarthy is all that great of a head coach. That's just kind of my opinion on that. I mean, like, when they really needed to win games a couple years ago, they started smashing watermelons in the locker room, things like that. Maybe we need something to get smashed before every game for the Cowboys to really get fired up. So I like the team. I just don't like the head coach.
Oh, look, man, you're speaking to a guy who lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, grew up 20 minutes outside Green Bay. I've been dealing with Mike McCarthy since 2006 when I was in elementary school, and he first became the Packers head coach. See, you're not looking at any fan of his over here. Let's talk about fantasy, because this offense, even though they may have taken a step back due to player personnel, they may have taken a step back on defense due to some player personnel losses, they're still going to be up-tempo and pass-heavy, and that certainly has value when we talk about underdog. So Dak Prescott's coming off the board at pick 85. That's about 20 picks behind Jalen Hurts. He's kind of in that, like Joe Burrow, Aaron Rodgers type range, and I think that's fine for him. He's not a runner. So that's about where he should go, in my opinion. The backfield's really interesting. You're getting Ezekiel Elliott cheaper than he's ever been at pick 40. But if you want to take Tony Pollard, he's coming off the board at pick 89. It's very unlikely that both of them pay off their ADPs. So I want to ask you if you have a preference between the two.
Yeah, I'm going to draft Zeke. I think drafting your own handcuff in Tony Pollard, again, in underdog, you don't want to be drafting. In best ball, don't draft a handcuff. I think that is immensely going to hurt the upside of your team. Don't do that. But
especially 2 in the top 90.
Yes, but in a redraft league, how confident could you be drafting Zeke in like the 4th, 5th round, and then in the 9th round you have to draft Tony Pollard? That's fucking crazy. Like, that's just insane. Like, even Alexander Madison who's a great backup, right? When Dalvin Cook gets hurt, Alexander Madison has top 5 upside. You don't have to draft him in the top 100. You don't have to draft him in the top 90. It's just insane. If you draft Zeke, there's no way I'm drafting Tony Pollard. And if I draft Tony Pollard, I'm not drafting Zeke, obviously. So if I'm drafting Zeke Elliott at pick 40, there's no way I'm touching Tony Pollard. And I'm just going to believe that maybe Zeke was really just banged up all of last year. Maybe those injuries were really impacting him. And maybe that's why he slowed down. He looked slow last year. Like, it looked like he was running in molasses or something. So I think
he tore his PCL in week 4.
Yeah. So he was looking real bad last year. So I think that him falling this far is a little bit crazy. Tony Pollard is immensely talented, right? Especially in like an underdog draft where you only need him to pay off a couple of times. He could really have those huge games for you when you don't have to pick when Tony Pollard's going to go off. Because unless Zeke's hurt, there's no way I want Tony Pollard in my roster. And when you're picking him inside the top 100, if you're playing in a league that has multiple flexes, like these fantasy football leagues now, they're getting deeper and deeper, that you're going to have to start more and more players. And if you have to start Tony Pollard every single week, you're shooting yourself directly in the foot. So I don't want anything to do with Tony Pollard really in redraft unless I think that Ezekiel Elliott's just finished, which I don't. So I'm not of that perspective. What do you think about Zeke?
I mean, lockstep with you. I would much rather get Zeke at his ADP than take Pollard. Pollard's ADP is higher. I realize why he's getting drafted ahead of guys like Alexander Madison. It's because he has standalone value, but we're drafting for ceilings, and Tony Pollard still needs an injury to access that ceiling. It's the same access point as Alexander Madison too. So I understand it a little more in best ball because you can benefit from the spike weeks. In redraft, they're going to be so hard to predict that if his ADP is anywhere near this in redraft, like, he's just going to be a stay away from me. So we're in lockstep there. The receivers are really interesting. I like CeeDee Lamb a lot. I think his ADP is fair at pick 14. All that is based on the available opportunity that Amari Cooper leaves behind. Not to mention Michael Gallup is coming off an ACL tear, and he did not have surgery on this right away. So looking at when he tore it, I think you need to look at when he actually had surgery because there was a delay there. We don't know when Gallup is going to be healthy. Pick 111 is way too rich for a player that might miss half the year, if not more. And again, it's similar to the Logan Thomas discussion we had earlier. We just don't know. ACL tears take a little while till you can kind of gauge when a player is going to return. There's a very real possibility Gallup misses half the year. And I don't think that's being baked into his ADP at 111. He's the very clear wide receiver 2 when healthy, but we just do not have help, which makes your take, James Washington, Jalen Tolbert, even more interesting. Like, there's a situation where both of them have to be on the field because Gallup's still injured. So James Washington at pick 205 as a player that has an access point to the wide receiver 3 and maybe wide receiver 2 if Gallup is injured, that's way too low. Also willing to take shots on Tolbert. Didn't love him as a prospect. He was an older guy coming out of South Alabama. So we're talking about G5 competition, but he excelled there and dominated. So I think these are players you want to take shots on. The thing for me is it's just Washington's going off the board 50 picks later, and you can literally stack Dak in the last round with him. So I like that quite a bit. Schultz is another guy who might just be the de facto wide receiver too if Gallup's injured. Pick 75, I think, is fine for Schultz. He's sort of in that Goddard range, but the offense is so high powered that I'm okay eating the ADP that he's providing. What do you think about the pass catchers?
Yeah, now I'm kind of a little bit opposite to you. I really like Gallup, but I didn't know that he didn't get surgery that late on. Like, I didn't know that it didn't happen instantly, and that does concern me a lot now. Now, every report I read the last couple of months ago, like in February, a report came out that, he'll be ready for the start of the season. But we haven't heard much about Michael Gallup recently, and that worries me as well. Like, when you don't hear about a guy, that's a little bit concerning. Now, this video is being recorded in May. If you guys are watching this in August, then maybe in August, it's very clear that, Gallup's going to be back by week 5, or maybe, Gallup's going to be back by week 14. Then you know what to do, obviously. But if Gallup is healthy, at least early on in the season, I'm fine drafting him where he's going, throwing him on my IR, and just being like, whatever, right? A couple weeks from now, I'll be able to play him. And I think once he is healthy, he is really the clear number 2 guy here. He is a guy that I could see getting big money. If he was to have went to a different team, if he stays healthy, has a good season, he could be the number 2 guy in a lot of teams, and maybe even the number 1 guy on teams that just, like the Jaguars, who just pay $1 zillion to get these scrubs to play wide receiver for him. So I think Michael Gallup is very talented, but the injury does concern me. And a guy that I don't think we talked about at all, maybe you did and I just missed it, but Dalton Schultz is a guy that I like a lot as well. He did amazing last year. There was a lot of talk about Blake Jarwin, and then Blake Jarwin was basically doing his best Houdini impression. You couldn't fucking find him. He was invisible. So I think in 2022, we see a little bit more of the consistency out of Dalton Schultz. We see him be the clear number one guy. And Dalton Schultz is going to be one of my favorite guys to play on DraftKings during those games because they have a million of those primetime games. I love playing the tight end as the captain. I love Dalton Schultz. So shout out Dalton Schultz.
Yeah, I like him too. I won't belabor anything you said. He just has a very clear path to targets and maybe even more than we think, depending on the Gallup situation. For me, this win total is a stay away at 10. And just to recap, my favorite win totals are going to be over on the Philadelphia Eagles, under on the Commanders. I would rather just stay away from the Giants and the Cowboys win totals. But anything you'd like to add on the division as a whole?
Yeah, so I agree with you. I would definitely go under on the Commanders. I love the over on the Eagles. I don't know what the odds are at right now. I don't think it's probably that fruitful, right, to bet the Eagles to win the division. I doubt it's like plus 500 or something like that.
No, you had to take that like before the draft. Obviously, because of AJ Brown, they shifted wildly.
Yeah, so I still think that if you want to throw some money down, I think the Eagles could win this division. I think they will win the division. And then the Cowboys, I like the over, but I think it probably will end up pushing. They'll probably win like 10 games, and then you'll feel bad about that. But as a whole, this is, while for real life, this is like uninteresting, right? There's just two teams fighting for first place, and then there's the Giants and the fucking Commanders. But in terms of fantasy football, these are really four rosters with a decent amount of players that you want on your fantasy team. And that's why fantasy football is so funny, because just because they're on a bad team doesn't mean that they're going to be bad. And a lot of people look at things that way. Don't look at it that way. I think that this is going to be very interesting for fantasy football, but for real life, man, I don't know how I'm going to be watching a lot of these Giants games, like the Giants play on prime time. I don't know who creates the fucking schedule. Why are the Giants getting so many prime time games? Like, why do the Commanders play the Giants on Monday night or Thursday night? Who wants to watch that? Like, who's getting pumped on Thursday to watch that?
Just big market in New York, I think, honestly. I don't know.
No, that is it 100%. It's just weird how every year, like even the Giants, they're declining. They keep declining. Same amount of primetime games every year. It's crazy.
Yeah, I don't know. But with that, that'll do it for us today. Thank you guys for watching. Please leave a comment. Let us know who you think is too high, maybe too low in this division, or just your thoughts overall on any of these player ADPs and fantasy draft. He is Nick Lepri. You can follow him on Twitter at Notorious Fantasy. I am Matt Gajewski. You can follow me at Matt_Gajewski. Thank you guys for watching, and we will be back again with more division previews later in the week. We'll see you later.